In the winter of 2018, I took a job as a night shift guard at an old state prison in Louisiana. The place had been running for decades, long before modern security systems and digital tracking. It still had thick iron doors, damp stone walls, and a constant chill that never seemed to go away. Most guards hated working nights, not because of the inmates, most of them were locked down tight, but because of the silence. The block I was assigned to had a reputation, Unit C. It housed lifers, the ones with nowhere left to go. They said once you were locked in Unit C, you never left. Not really. Most of the cells were filled, except for one, Cell 13. It sat at the far end of the block, always closed, always empty. On my first night, I asked the lead officer why no one was placed there. He just gave me a look and said, "They don't last." At first I thought he meant the inmates transferred out, but he didn't say anything else, and I let it go. A week into the job, I was doing my rounds when I heard something, a low mumbling coming from the end of the block. The other prisoners were asleep or quietly talking in their cells, but the noise wasn't coming from them. It was coming from Cell 13. I stopped in my tracks. The cell was supposed to be empty. Slowly, I walked up to the bars, shining my flashlight inside. There was a man sitting on the cot. His back was turned to me, his shoulders hunched. He was whispering something over and over, too fast to understand. My breath caught in my throat. I checked my log. No one had been placed in Cell 13. I cleared my throat, forcing my voice to stay calm as I called out. The whispering stopped. The figure slowly turned his head. And there was no one there. The cot was empty. The room was empty. I felt cold all over, a kind of cold that settled into my bones. I backed away, trying to convince myself that maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just tired. But then from behind the bars I heard it, a whisper. "You see me now?" I reported it to the lead officer the next day, expecting him to laugh or tell me I was imagining things. Instead, he just nodded like he had heard it all before. Then he told me what happened to the last inmate who was placed in Cell 13. The man had been transferred in for a short stay before being sent to a federal facility. He lasted 2 nights. On the third, they found him in his cell, curled into the corner, eyes wide open, dead. There were no signs of struggle, no wounds, no explanation, but the most disturbing part, the guards who found him said he was still whispering, even though he was already gone. I never went near Cell 13 again. And to this day I wonder, was he ever really alone? Or was something else in that cell waiting for someone to notice? In the fall of 2016, I worked as a prison nurse in a maximum security facility in Arizona. It wasn't my first time working in a high-risk environment, but something about this prison felt different. The air was always heavy, and the walls felt like they held more than just the echoes of inmates. One of the prisoners, a man named Daniel Lark, had been there for over 20 years. He wasn't violent, wasn't known for outbursts, but the other inmates avoided him like the plague. He didn't have a cellmate. No one spoke to him. It was like he existed in a bubble that no one wanted to step into. One night I was called to check on Lark. The guards had found him standing in his cell, staring at the wall, not blinking. He hadn't responded when they spoke to him. I walked down the row, past the usual noise, men talking, laughing, some arguing, but as I got closer to Lark's cell, everything went silent. The other inmates had turned away, some even covering their faces like they didn't want to see what was happening. The hair on my arm stood up, but I forced myself forward. Lark was still standing, his face inches from the concrete wall. I called his name, but he didn't move. I stepped closer, shining my small medical flashlight near his eyes. His pupils didn't react. Then he spoke. "They let him in," he said. His voice was dry, barely above a whisper. I asked who. He didn't answer, just kept staring. One of the guards sighed, saying this wasn't the first time Lark had done something like this. They figured he was just losing his mind after so many years alone. They told me to mark it down as a psychological episode, and I did, but something about his words stuck with me. That night I couldn't sleep. My room in the staff quarters was small, with only a single bed and a metal locker. Around 3 a.m. I woke up to the feeling of someone standing over me. My breath caught in my throat. My room was pitch black, but I could sense it, something there, watching. I reached for my bedside lamp, but before I could turn it on, I heard a whisper, "They let him in." My heart nearly stopped. I turned on the light, my hands shaking. The room was empty, the door was still locked, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day I went back to check on Lark. His cell was empty. Confused, I asked the guards where he was. They looked at me like I'd lost my mind. One of them even laughed. "There is no Daniel Lark here," I insisted, describing him, explaining how I had seen him just the night before. But they shook their heads. There was no record of him in the system. No inmate under that name had ever been housed there. I didn't argue, I didn't push. I just walked away, heart pounding in my chest. Because when I glanced at the cell one last time, I saw something that still haunts me to this day. Scratched into the wall, deep enough to gouge the concrete, were 3 words. They let him in. In the summer of 2015, I worked as a corrections officer in a prison in Texas. It was an old facility, built decades ago with thick stone walls and heavy steel doors that groaned when they moved. My assignment was solitary confinement, also known as the hole. It was where they sent the worst of the worst: violent offenders, gang leaders, inmates who had attacked guards or other prisoners. It was the last stop before complete isolation. I never liked working the hole. It was silent in a way that felt unnatural, like the walls had absorbed the screams and left behind something empty. There was one inmate, though, that made it worse. His name was Elliot Grayson. He had been in solitary for months, locked away after attacking his cellmate. No one knew why he did it. One day he just snapped. By the time I started working the block, Elliot wasn't speaking anymore. He didn't react when the guards brought him food, didn't respond to commands. He just sat in his cell, staring at the same spot on the far wall. The other inmates avoided talking about him. When I asked what his deal was, one of the older guards just shook his head. "He listens," was all he said. One night during my rounds, I stopped outside Elliot's cell. He was in his usual position, sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at the wall. But something about the way he was sitting felt different. Tense, expectant. I don't know what made me do it, but I spoke. "What are you looking at?" For the first time since he had been put in the hole, Elliot turned his head, slowly, like it took all his strength. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, his lips cracked, his voice was barely a whisper. It opened. I felt a chill run through me. I followed his gaze to the wall, but there was nothing there. Just cold stone. Like always, I asked him what he meant, but he wouldn't answer. He just kept looking at me, like he was waiting for me to understand. I stepped away, finishing my rounds, but I couldn't shake the feeling. When I got back to the security desk, I pulled up the old blueprints of the prison. Something about that wall had been nagging at me, and I wanted to see what was behind it. What I found made my stomach drop. That wall, it wasn't supposed to be there. The original layout of the hole showed a door where Elliot had been staring. A door that no longer existed. It had been sealed off decades ago. I didn't sleep that night. I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was nothing. But the next night, when I walked past Elliot's cell, I heard it, a faint knocking, coming from inside the wall. I stopped, my body locking up. Elliot was still sitting there, eyes locked on the stone, but this time he was smiling. A slow, too-wide grin. I took a step closer, pressing my ear to the cold surface. 3 slow knocks. Then a whisper, not Elliot's. Something else. "Let me out." I backed away, heart pounding. Elliot started laughing, not loud, not normal. Just a quiet, breathy chuckle, like he knew something I didn't. The next day I put in for a transfer. I didn't care what it took. I wasn't working the hole anymore. A week later, Elliot was gone. They said he vanished. His cell was locked. The cameras showed no one entering or exiting, but when the guards checked inside, all they found was his uniform neatly folded on the floor, and on the wall, scratched deep into the stone, was one word: open. Some prisoners never leave, some were never supposed to be there, and some find their own way out. If these stories kept you on edge, hit like, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more chilling true horror stories. And don't forget to hit the bell icon, because some horrors are still waiting to be uncovered.